A flight attendant kicks a black boy off the plane, humiliating him in front of everyone. She assumes he doesn't belong until 3 minutes later, when the entire airline is turned upside down. Because this boy isn't just another passenger. He's the heir to a billion-dollar empire. And when he makes a single phone call, the plane is forced to return. But this time, he's not just boarding. He's taking over. What happens when the flight crew realizes their new boss is the very boy they threw out? And will he choose revenge, or something even more shocking? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the airport terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The air hummed with the familiar sounds of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the constant chatter of travelers rushing to their destinations. Elijah Kingsley walked with measured steps through the terminal, his designer sneakers silent against the floor. His dark blue blazer and fitted jeans spoke of casual elegance, a deliberate choice that set him apart from the sea of traditional business suits. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth, even if others didn't see it right away. His phone buzzed in his hand. Another text from Vanessa lit up the screen. Board members confirmed for tomorrow's meeting. Thompson still trying to delay the vote. Elijah's lips curved into a slight smile as he typed back, "Let him try." He slipped the phone into his pocket, adjusting the leather messenger bag on his shoulder as he approached the first-class boarding lane. The line moved steadily, business travelers clutching their laptops and carry-ons, most of them absorbed in their own worlds. Elijah noticed the subtle glances thrown his way, the quick double takes, the raised eyebrows, the whispered comments. He'd seen it all before, the same looks since he'd taken over his father's company at 25. When it was his turn, he pulled out his boarding pass and ID, holding them ready for Linda Carter, the flight attendant manning the gate. Her blue uniform was crisp, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her smile practiced and professional, until she looked at him. Her eyes skimmed over him, dismissing him before even checking his documents. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet gate area. "This line is for first class only. The economy boarding is over there." She pointed to the longer line across the way. Elijah held out his ticket, his expression unchanging. "And that's exactly where I'm supposed to be." His voice was calm, measured, carrying the same tone he used in boardroom negotiations. Behind him, he heard the rustle of movement, felt the weight of stairs. A man in an expensive suit chuckled, the sound sharp and knowing. "We all know what's happening here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't even reach for the ticket Elijah held out, instead looking past him to catch the eye of a security guard. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." "Is there a problem?" Elijah asked, still holding his ticket steady. "You haven't even checked my boarding pass." "He's trying to scam his way into first class," Linda announced to the growing crowd of onlookers, her voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed to justify her actions. She waved urgently at two security guards who were already moving toward them. The guards, both tall and broad-shouldered, approached with purpose. Without a word, without checking his ticket, without asking a single question, one of them grabbed Elijah's arm. His grip was tight, unnecessarily forceful. Elijah didn't resist. He'd been here before. Different places, different faces, same story. His chest tightened with a familiar pressure, a mix of anger and resignation that he'd learned to control years ago. He kept his breathing steady, his face composed, even as his pulse quickened. Phones appeared from all directions, their cameras pointed at him like accusatory fingers. The businessman who had spoken earlier made no attempt to hide his smirk. "Told you," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the now silent gate area. "They always try to cheat the system." The second guard moved to Elijah's other side, though he hadn't shown any sign of resistance. They began leading him away from the gate, past the rows of seated passengers waiting for their zones to be called. Every face turned to watch, some with curiosity, others with judgment, a few with uncomfortable recognition of what was really happening. Elijah remained silent, but something inside him burned. Not just anger. He'd moved past simple anger years ago. This was different. This was fuel for what came next. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably Vanessa already getting alerts about the situation. She would be watching, documenting, preparing. The guards marched him toward the security office, their steps echoing in the terminal. They passed other gates where more passengers stopped to stare and whisper. Elijah kept his head high, his face composed. He'd learned early that showing emotion in these moments only fed into their narratives. Inside, he felt the familiar fire building. Not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that forged something stronger. Every step away from that gate wasn't just a step of humiliation. It was a step toward change. Because while they saw what they wanted to see, a young black man they assumed didn't belong in first class, they had no idea they were manhandling the majority shareholder of the very airline they worked for. They were about to learn that assumptions came with consequences, and change sometimes arrived in ways you least expected it. As the security office door loomed ahead, Elijah felt the weight of his father's legacy and his own vision for the future settling on his shoulders. The fire inside him burned steady and sure, ready to light the way forward. The automatic doors of the airport terminal slid open with a soft hiss as Elijah stepped through them. The cool air inside was a stark contrast to the heat he felt burning in his chest. He paused for a moment, straightening the designer hoodie he wore beneath his blazer, and let out a long, controlled exhale. His fingers drummed against his thigh, a rare tell that betrayed his carefully maintained composure. Anyone who knew him well understood that this subtle gesture meant something significant had occurred. Vanessa stood waiting near a row of cushioned seats, her tablet tucked under one arm. The moment she caught sight of him, her professional demeanor shifted. She'd worked with Elijah long enough to read the subtle signs others might miss. The slight tension in his jaw, the measured pace of his steps, the way his eyes focused on some distant point. Something had gone wrong, and from the set of his shoulders, it was serious. Their years of working together had forged an unspoken language between them. "What the hell happened?" she asked, closing the distance between them with quick steps. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, drawing brief glances from passing travelers. Her voice was low but urgent, concern etched across her features. Elijah didn't answer immediately. His movements were deliberate as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen reflected in his dark eyes as his thumb scrolled through contacts. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the ambient noise of the terminal, announcements echoing overhead, the steady stream of conversations, rolling luggage wheels against tile. His face remained impassive, but Vanessa could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. Vanessa watched as he found the number he was looking for. She recognized the look on his face. It was the same expression he wore before making moves that reshaped entire markets. Whatever had happened at the gate had pushed him past a point of no return. She braced herself, knowing that when Elijah reached this state, seismic changes followed. The phone rang 3 times before Mr. Whitmore's voice came through, artificially bright and clearly surprised. "Elijah, to what do I owe the pleasure?" The fake enthusiasm in his tone was almost palpable, the kind reserved for unexpected calls from major shareholders who needed to be appeased rather than truly welcomed. Elijah's response was measured, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. "You just lost your airline." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by what sounded like Whitmore's sharp intake of breath. "What?" The single word came out strangled, the false cheer completely gone, replaced by genuine shock. "I'm buying it," Elijah continued, his tone unchanged. He checked his watch, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes about his state of mind. "Right now, you have 3 minutes to get the paperwork ready." His words weren't a threat, but a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome. The sound of papers shuffling came through the phone, followed by Whitmore's stammering voice. "Wait, Elijah, let's talk." The panic in his tone was evident now, all pretense stripped away, revealing the desperation of a man watching his control slip away. Elijah's eyes met Vanessa's, and she saw in them the same fire that had driven him to revolutionize his father's tech company. He ignored Whitmore's protests, speaking instead to her. "Make the call. Now." Vanessa nodded once, sharply, already pulling out her own phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, sending out the pre-arranged signal to Elijah's legal and finance teams. They'd prepared for this possibility. Not this exact scenario, perhaps, but the eventual acquisition of the airline. The pieces had been in place for months, waiting for the right moment. She felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. This was why she had joined Elijah's team in the first place. As she initiated the sequence of calls that would set the financial markets buzzing, she could hear Whitmore's increasingly desperate voice through Elijah's phone. The man was still talking, trying to backpedal, to negotiate, to understand what had triggered this sudden move. But Vanessa knew it wasn't sudden at all. It was merely the final push needed to set in motion what Elijah had been planning since he first recognized the systemic issues plaguing the airline industry. His vision had always been clear, even when others couldn't see it. Around them, the terminal continued its normal rhythm. Passengers rushing to gates, families saying goodbyes, business travelers typing on laptops, none of them aware that right there, in that unremarkable corner of the airport, decisions were being made that would reshape an entire industry. Lives would change, policies would shift, and a new era would begin, all because someone had finally pushed Elijah Kingsley too far. Elijah stood perfectly still now, his free hand relaxed at his side, no longer showing any signs of the tension that had marked his earlier entrance. The fire hadn't gone out. It had simply been channeled into purpose. His voice, when he spoke again into the phone, carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The paperwork, Mr. Whitmore. 2 minutes." Vanessa's own phone buzzed with confirmations from their legal team. They were ready, had been ready. The stock market was about to shift, and with it, the balance of power in an industry that had remained unchanged for far too long. She caught Elijah's eye and gave him a small, knowing smile. This was just the beginning of the transformation they had envisioned together. Meanwhile, the sleek glass and steel headquarters of Kingsley Enterprises towered above the city skyline, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. On the 42nd floor, the atmosphere crackled with focused energy as Elijah's elite team of financial experts and lawyers gathered in the main conference room. The space, usually pristine and orderly, now hummed with controlled chaos. Dozens of laptops lined the long mahogany table, their screens displaying rapidly changing stock prices and complex financial data. The room's usual silence was broken by the sound of rapid typing and urgent phone conversations conducted in hushed professional tones. Sarah, head of acquisitions, sat at the center of the activity, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she coordinated the complex dance of stock purchases. Her normally immaculate suit jacket hung on the back of her chair, and her sleeves were rolled up, a clear sign that this was no ordinary workday. "Initial wave of purchases going through now," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "We're starting with the smaller shareholders first." Her screen reflected the cascade of transactions in her glasses as she worked. Next to her, Marcus Rodriguez, the lead corporate attorney, spoke rapidly into his Bluetooth headset while scanning legal documents on 2 separate monitors. "Yes, we need those signatures now. Not in an hour, not in 30 minutes. Now." His tie had come loose, but his voice remained steady and authoritative. The room's eastern wall, made entirely of smart glass, had transformed into an enormous display showing real-time market data. Green and red numbers flickered and changed, telling the story of what was quickly becoming the fastest hostile takeover in corporate history. "Current ownership at 43%, called out James Turner from the financial analysis desk. His usual calm demeanor showed cracks of excitement as he watched their plan unfold. Moving into position for the final push. The team had prepared for this moment for months, though none had expected it to happen today. Emergency protocols were activated, and pre-positioned resources were deployed with military precision. Every person in the room knew their role, understood the stakes, and moved with purpose. "Legal clearance confirmed on the next block of shares," Marcus announced, giving Sarah the green light to proceed. She nodded without looking up, her hands already moving to execute the next phase of purchases. The smart glass wall showed the airline's stock price beginning to climb as word of the massive buyout spread through the market. Other traders were starting to notice the unusual activity, but by then it was too late to affect the outcome. 47%, James called out, his voice rising slightly. The energy in the room intensified as they approached the crucial threshold. Sarah's screen filled with confirmation messages as transaction after transaction completed successfully. 49.5, she reported, her usual professional detachment slipping just enough to reveal a hint of satisfaction. The phone on the conference table rang, its sound cutting through the focused atmosphere. Everyone knew who it had to be. Mr. Whitmore's name flashed on the display, but no one moved to answer it. They had their orders. Only Elijah would deal with the soon-to-be former CEO. 50%, James announced, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of triumph. The phone rang again and again. 50.5. Another ring. 51%, James declared, and for a moment the room fell silent. Then Sarah hit her final key with an audible click. "Transaction complete," she said, sitting back in her chair for the first time in hours. "Majority control secured." The phone rang once more, and this time Elijah's voice came through the conference room speakers. He had been connected the entire time, watching from his position at the airport. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice filling the room. "I believe you've been trying to reach me." "Elijah, please." Whitmore's voice was strained, desperate. "Let's negotiate. We can work something out." "Recall that plane." Elijah's command cut through Whitmore's pleas like a knife through butter. There was a pause on the line. When Whitmore spoke again, his voice had risen an octave, but it already took off. "Then turn it around," Elijah interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Because your new boss isn't on it." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shifted power. Everyone in the conference room remained perfectly still, watching the call display on the smart glass wall. I'll make the call," Whitmore finally responded, his voice small and defeated. Sarah and her team exchanged glances as they listened to the muffled sound of Whitmore barking orders to his staff. On their screens, they could already see the news breaking across financial networks, headlines announcing the unexpected takeover of one of the country's largest airlines. Through the speakers, they heard the distant sound of airport announcements and knew Elijah was still standing in the terminal, watching as his orders were carried out. The plane that had denied him boarding would soon return to the gate, but by then, everything would have changed. Marcus was already pulling up the necessary documentation for the transfer of operational control. Sarah's team began organizing the data that would be needed for the immediate shareholder notifications. James and his analysts started preparing the required SEC filings. The room gradually returned to its usual efficient rhythm, but now with a different energy. The satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan, combined with the anticipation of what would come next. They all knew this was just the beginning. Elijah hadn't bought an airline simply to prove a point. He had bought it to transform it. Through the speakers, they heard the distinct sound of an airport announcement. Flight 2857 to New York is returning to the gate due to operational requirements. All passengers please remain seated until we reach the terminal. Inside Flight 2857, the air conditioning hummed steadily as passengers settled into their seats for what they thought would be a routine flight to New York. The cabin crew had just finished their pre-flight checks, and Linda Carter stood near the galley, mentally reviewing her duties for the journey ahead. The plane's intercom crackled to life, its sudden sound drawing everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received instructions to return to the gate due to operational requirements. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the terminal." Linda's professional smile faltered as confusion crossed her face. In her 15 years as a flight attendant, she'd rarely experienced a return to gate after takeoff without a mechanical issue or medical emergency. She glanced at her colleague, Jessica, who shared her puzzled expression. "Why are we returning to the gate?" Linda asked, more to herself than anyone else. She straightened her navy uniform jacket and walked toward the cockpit, her heels clicking against the aircraft's floor. Through the cockpit door's small window, she could see Captain Richards speaking urgently into his headset, his usually calm demeanor replaced by visible bewilderment. His co-pilot sat beside him, repeatedly checking various instruments as if searching for a problem that wasn't there. The plane banked gently, beginning its return to the terminal. In the cabin, passengers stirred restlessly in their seats. Whispers of speculation traveled up and down the aisles like a game of telephone gone wrong. Some passengers pulled out their phones, presumably checking for news of any incidents that might explain their unexpected return. "Maybe it's a security issue," one passenger suggested loudly enough for others to hear. "Could be weather," another offered, though the sky outside remained clear and blue. Linda moved through the cabin, offering reassuring smiles that felt increasingly forced. The businessman who had laughed at Elijah earlier caught her eye and raised an eyebrow questioningly, but she could only respond with a small shrug. The aircraft's wheels touched down smoothly, and Captain Richards guided the plane back to their original gate with practiced precision. As they approached, Linda noticed an unusual gathering through the terminal windows. Several men in dark suits standing at attention, their presence commanding and professional. The plane came to a complete stop, and the familiar sound of the jet bridge extending filled the cabin. Linda's heart rate quickened as she noticed Mr. Whitmore himself standing among the suited men. The CEO rarely made appearances at the gate, and his presence, combined with their unexpected return, sent a chill down her spine. The cabin door opened with its characteristic hydraulic hiss, and Linda's world shifted on its axis. Elijah Kingsley walked in, his casual designer wear now somehow looking more imposing than before. His presence filled the cabin differently this time, not as a passenger to be questioned, but as someone who commanded absolute authority. Mr. Whitmore followed close behind, his usual confident stride reduced to something more hesitant. Behind them came several security personnel, their earpieces and alert postures marking them as high-level protection rather than regular airport security. The same passengers who had smirked and laughed earlier now sat in stunned silence. The businessman who had made the snide comments seemed to shrink in his seat, suddenly very interested in his phone screen. Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice carrying through the hushed cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Elijah Kingsley, our new majority owner." The words landed like thunder in the quiet cabin. Gasps rippled through the rows of seats, followed by hurried whispers and the sound of phones being unlocked as passengers rushed to search for news about what had just happened. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees weakened, and she had to steady herself against a seat back. The memory of her earlier actions played back in her mind with horrifying clarity. Her dismissive tone, her assumptions, her call to security. She had racially profiled and humiliated the man who now owned the entire airline. Elijah moved with unhurried confidence to his first-class seat, the same one she had tried to deny him earlier. Jessica, who had been in the galley during the earlier incident, quickly approached with a bottle of champagne and a crystal flute. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, but Elijah acknowledged her service with a polite nod. Only then did he turn his gaze to Linda. His eyes held no anger, no triumph, no emotion at all, just a steady, penetrating look that made her feel transparent. "You assumed I didn't belong," he said evenly, his voice carrying in the silent cabin. The words weren't loud, but they seemed to echo off every surface. Linda's throat felt dry. Her usual professional composure crumbled as she struggled to form words. I didn't know," she began, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining calm, but intensely focused. "Would you have treated me differently if I wasn't rich?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. The entire cabin fell silent, not the routine quiet of a flight in progress, but the heavy silence of collective realization. Phones stopped clicking, conversations ceased mid-word, and even the usual shuffling of passengers adjusting in their seats went still. Linda stood frozen, her uniform feeling suddenly too tight, too confining. The question stripped away every defense, every excuse she might have prepared. It laid bare the ugly truth she had never wanted to face about her own prejudices, her own biases, her own role in perpetuating discrimination. The first-class cabin of Flight 2857 had transformed from a space of luxury into an arena of palpable tension. The soft leather seats that usually promised comfort now seemed to cradle guilt and regret. The subtle lighting that typically soothed weary travelers now felt like a spotlight, exposing uncomfortable truths that no one wanted to face. The gentle hum of the engines, normally a reassuring background noise, now seemed to underscore the heavy silence that had fallen over the passengers. Linda stood rooted to her spot, her navy uniform feeling like lead weights on her shoulders. Her hands, usually steady from years of serving drinks at 30,000 feet, trembled visibly. The professional mask she'd worn for 15 years had cracked, revealing the raw fear and shame underneath. Beads of sweat formed at her hairline, and her makeup felt suddenly thick and suffocating on her skin. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kingsley," she managed to stammer out. The words felt inadequate the moment they left her lips, floating in the air like empty promises. Her voice, normally confident when making announcements over the intercom, now sounded small and hollow. Elijah lifted the crystal flute to his lips, taking an unhurried sip of champagne. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as he set the glass back down on his armrest. The soft clink of crystal against metal seemed to echo in the uncomfortable silence. His dark eyes remained fixed on Linda, neither angry nor forgiving, but watchful and assessing. "You weren't sorry when you had me dragged out in front of everyone," he replied, his voice level but carrying an edge that made several passengers flinch. The truth in his words cut through the cabin's filtered air like a blade. "You weren't sorry until you learned who I am." Linda swallowed hard, her throat constricting. The memory of her actions played back in her mind like a horror movie she couldn't stop. Her dismissive glance at his ticket, her immediate assumption that he didn't belong, the casual way she'd called security. Each recollection felt like another weight added to her conscience. The worst part was knowing he was right. Her apology came from fear, not genuine remorse. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some became intensely interested in their phones or the safety cards in their seat pockets. Others couldn't help but steal furtive glances at the scene unfolding before them, like witnesses to a slow-motion car crash they couldn't look away from. A few whispered behind cupped hands, eyes wide with the delicious scandal of it all. Mr. Lancaster, the well-dressed businessman who had so confidently mocked Elijah earlier, suddenly straightened in his seat. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by an almost desperate attempt at damage control. He leaned forward, his expensive suit crinkling slightly, the gold cufflinks catching the cabin light as he moved. "Mr. Kingsley, I had no idea," he began, his voice taking on an ingratiating tone that hadn't been there before. The words dripped with a sudden transparent respect that had been notably absent during their previous interaction. Elijah's hand rose in a swift, decisive motion, cutting through Lancaster's words like a conductor silencing an orchestra. "Save it," he said, his voice sharp enough to make Lancaster recoil slightly. "Your words told me exactly who you are." The quiet dignity in his refusal spoke volumes about the man he had become, despite people like Lancaster. Lancaster's mouth snapped shut, and he sank back into his seat, his face flushing red. The other passengers who had laughed along with him earlier now seemed to shrink in their seats, as if trying to make themselves invisible. A woman in a designer suit suddenly found her magazine fascinating. A man with a gold watch became absorbed in the clouds outside his window. In the midst of this tense tableau, Sarah, a younger flight attendant who had been observing everything from the galley, stepped forward. Unlike Linda, her movements were purposeful and controlled. She had watched the earlier incident unfold with quiet disapproval, and now her presence seemed to offer a contrast to the chaos of emotions swirling through the cabin. Her uniform looked crisp and neat, her posture professional but not subservient. "Mr. Kingsley, would you like another drink?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. There was no tremor in her tone, no desperate attempt to curry favor, just simple, respectful service. Her eyes met his directly, neither challenging nor fearful. Elijah turned his attention to her, studying her for a moment before giving a slight nod. He noticed how her hands remained steady as she reached for his glass, how she maintained her composure while everyone around her seemed to be falling apart. There was something refreshing about her straightforward approach after the suffocating hypocrisy that surrounded him. Linda remained frozen in place, her body rigid with anticipation. Every second felt like an hour as she waited for the words that would end her career. She could already imagine the headlines. "Flight attendant fired after racially profiling airline's new owner." Her mind raced through alternatives, other airlines, different careers, anything that might help her survive what seemed like an inevitable dismissal. 20 years of building her life around this job, gone in an instant of prejudice. Instead of addressing her directly, Elijah pulled out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he composed a text to Vanessa. Linda watched, her heart pounding, as he typed what she assumed would be her professional death sentence. Each tap of his finger on the screen felt like another nail in the coffin of her career. "Make sure every employee undergoes racial bias training," he wrote, "starting with her." The message sent with a soft swoosh, and Linda felt her legs go weak with relief. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the sound barely audible over the ambient noise of the cabin. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a chance, something more than she had offered him. The plane began its taxi down the runway, engines humming with increasing power. Through the windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, marking the end of what had become a pivotal day for everyone on board. The aircraft lifted off, carrying with it a cabin full of people forever changed by the last hour's events. As the ground fell away beneath them, old prejudices and comfortable assumptions seemed to stay behind, unable to follow them into the clouds. An hour into the flight, the gentle hum of the engines provided a steady backdrop to the soft tapping of fingers on screens throughout the cabin. Elijah sat in his first-class seat, scrolling through his phone with measured calm, though his jaw tightened slightly at what he saw. His name blazed across social media platforms, climbing trending lists with remarkable speed. The videos were everywhere, different angles, different captions, but all showing the same sequence of events. The most viral clip started with Linda's dismissive expression as she called security, not even bothering to check his ticket properly. It captured the way the guards had grabbed his arm, the smirks from other passengers, and Mr. Lancaster's condescending comment. Then it cut to the dramatic return, Linda's face draining of color as Whitmore introduced Elijah as the new owner. The caption beneath it read, "When you kick a black man off a flight and he buys the airline 3 minutes later." The view count was skyrocketing. Comments flooded in by the thousands. This is what systemic racism looks like. Best Uno reverse card ever. Finally, someone with the power to make real change. Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Media is reaching out. News outlets already running the story. Another buzz. CNN wants an exclusive. So does MSNBC. Fox News, too. A third message appeared. "You've struck a nerve. This is bigger than we anticipated. How do you want to handle it?" He reached up to rub his temple, the weight of what was unfolding settling onto his shoulders. What had started as a personal stand against discrimination had exploded into something much larger. The incident was becoming a symbol, a rallying cry for countless others who had faced similar treatment but lacked the resources to fight back. He hadn't planned for this level of attention, but some part of him recognized this moment as an opportunity, a chance to force the conversation that polite society kept avoiding. Around him, the cabin hummed with whispered conversations. Passengers hunched over their phones, reading articles and social media posts about what they had witnessed firsthand. Some cast furtive glances his way, then quickly looked down when he caught their eye. The air felt charged with a mixture of embarrassment, anxiety, and fascination. A few passengers seemed to be recording discreetly, hoping to capture any follow-up drama for their own social media accounts. Mr. Lancaster, who had been so confident in his prejudice earlier, now sat rigid in his seat. Sweat darkened the collar of his expensive shirt, and his complexion had taken on a sickly pallor. Every few minutes, he would check his phone, likely watching his own face appear in the viral videos, his sneering comments preserved for millions to hear. His fingers trembled slightly as he loosened his tie, the reality of his public humiliation clearly sinking in. The rustle of expensive fabric drew Elijah's attention as a woman in a designer suit leaned forward from the row behind him. Her perfectly manicured nails gripped the back of his seat as she asked, "Mr. Kingsley, will you be taking action against the flight attendant?" Her voice carried just enough to ensure others could hear, threading curiosity with a hint of dramatic anticipation. The question hung in the air. Several passengers stopped their conversations to listen. Linda, who had been trying to make herself invisible while performing her duties, froze mid-step in the aisle. The color drained from her face again, and her hands began to tremble so badly she had to grip the nearby seat to steady herself. A water bottle slipped from her grasp, rolling across the carpet with a soft thud. Elijah turned slightly in his seat, his movement deliberate and measured. His eyes moved from the questioning passenger to Linda, taking in her obvious distress. The flight attendant looked like she might faint, her professional composure completely shattered. Her breathing had become shallow and quick, panic evident in every line of her body. The badge on her uniform, the same one she'd tapped when dismissing him earlier, now seemed to weigh her down like an anchor. He took a moment to consider his response, aware that whatever he said would likely end up online within minutes. The woman waited, phone discreetly positioned to capture his answer. Other passengers leaned in slightly, not wanting to miss his words. Even the cabin's ambient noise seemed to quiet, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Finally, Elijah exhaled, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed cabin. "I'm not interested in revenge," he stated firmly. "I'm interested in change." The woman nodded, clearly impressed by his response. She sat back, already typing on her phone, no doubt sharing his words with her social media followers. Around the cabin, other passengers seemed to relax slightly, as if his refusal to seek vengeance had somehow absolved them of their own complicity in the earlier events. A few nodded in approval, while others looked away, perhaps confronting their own silence during his mistreatment. Linda remained frozen in the aisle, her chest barely moving. Despite Elijah's words, she couldn't seem to draw a proper breath. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips slightly parted, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. The weight of her actions, now amplified by millions of views and shares, seemed to press down on her with physical force. The knowledge that her moment of prejudice would live forever online, a cautionary tale for others, appeared to be almost too much for her to process. A single tear escaped down her cheek, catching the cabin light as it fell. Meanwhile, in the gleaming glass tower of Metropolitan Airways headquarters, Mr. Whitmore paced his corner office like a caged animal. His normally pristine desk was cluttered with papers, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, but he barely noticed the time passing. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing for the past hour, each notification making him flinch like a small electric shock. Another call came in, this time from the board chairman. Whitmore's hand shook as he declined it, adding it to the growing list of unanswered calls. He couldn't face them yet. Not until he had a plan, something, anything, to salvage what was quickly becoming a corporate disaster. His computer screen displayed a financial nightmare. The airline's stock was plummeting, the graph showing a sharp downward trend that made his stomach churn. Major shareholders were dumping their positions, creating a cascade effect that threatened to erase millions in market value within hours. The red numbers seemed to mock him with each refresh of the page. "Sir?" His assistant, Margaret, appeared at the door, her usually composed face tight with worry. "CNN is on line 1, MSNBC on line 2, Fox News keeps calling, and the Washington Post wants a statement within the hour." Whitmore grabbed his antacids from the desk drawer, popping 2 into his mouth and chewing frantically. "Tell them we're preparing an official response. And the board of directors. They're demanding an emergency meeting." He slumped into his leather chair, which suddenly felt less comfortable than usual, like it too was rejecting him. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning. I need time to..." His words were cut off by a notification on his computer. Breaking news banners flashed across every major news website. Tech billionaire buys airline after racial profiling incident. The video of Elijah being removed from the plane had already garnered millions of views, spreading like wildfire across the internet. Social media was even worse. Kingsley Takeover and Flying While Black were trending nationwide. Celebrity activists were sharing the story. Civil rights organizations were calling for boycotts. Politicians were tweeting about launching investigations into discriminatory practices in the airline industry. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Whitmore's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from his biggest remaining shareholder. "Fix this now." He jabbed the intercom button with such force that his finger hurt. "Get PR in here. Everyone, now." Within minutes, his spacious office filled with anxious faces. The PR team filed in, led by Jessica Chen, the head of communications. They all carried tablets and laptops, their expressions grim as they took seats around the conference table. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Tell me you have something," Whitmore demanded, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the panic he was trying to hide. Jessica cleared her throat. "Sir, we've drafted several possible statements, but..." "But what?" "But the situation is complicated." She swiped through her tablet, her fingers moving nervously. "The video has gone viral. It's not just about one incident anymore. People are sharing their own stories of discrimination on our flights. It's becoming a movement." Whitmore loosened his tie further, feeling like it was choking him. "We need a statement. Something that says we don't tolerate discrimination." He looked around the room desperately. "We're an equal opportunity employer, right? Get those numbers. Show them our diversity statistics." The PR team exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jessica hesitated before speaking, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, that's not going to be enough. The public wants real action. They're calling for systematic changes, better training programs, revised policies. Then we'll fire the flight attendant, Whitmore snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. Several people jumped at the sudden noise. Make her the scapegoat. Say we've terminated her employment and are committed to reviewing our procedures. Jessica shook her head, her expression resolute. With all due respect, sir, firing one employee won't solve this. It might actually make things worse. It could look like we're trying to sweep larger issues under the rug. Worse? Whitmore laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the tense room. How could it possibly get worse? As if in answer, Margaret appeared at the door again, her face pale as fresh snow. Sir, Elijah Kingsley is calling. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Whitmore, who had frozen in his chair. The phone on his desk began to ring, its sound unnaturally loud in the quiet office, like a countdown to his inevitable downfall. Whitmore stared at the phone like it was a snake about to strike. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. He knew what this call meant. In just a few hours, Elijah Kingsley had managed to do what Whitmore had feared for years: take control of the airline he'd spent decades climbing to the top of. The phone continued to ring, each chime seeming to echo off the glass walls. The PR team sat motionless, watching their CEO's internal struggle play out on his face. Jessica clutched her tablet tighter, while others looked down at their hands, unable to watch what was coming, like witnesses to an execution. Whitmore's finger hovered over the answer button. In that moment, he saw his career flash before his eyes. The countless board meetings, the political maneuvering, the careful cultivation of old money networks. All of it was about to change because of one flight, one incident, one young man he'd severely underestimated. A mistake he now realized would cost him everything. The ringing persisted, demanding an answer. Whitmore knew he couldn't avoid this conversation. He couldn't hide from what was coming. His control over Metropolitan Airways was slipping away with each passing second, and Elijah Kingsley's call represented the final transfer of power, the changing of the guard. With a shaking hand, he reached for the phone. Whitmore's hand trembled as he held the phone to his ear, forcing brightness into his voice that he didn't feel. The PR team watched anxiously as their CEO attempted to salvage what little control he had left. Elijah, listen, let's work together to fix this situation. Miles above the ground, Elijah reclined in his first-class seat, gazing out at the endless expanse of clouds drifting past his window. The setting sun painted them in shades of gold and pink, but his attention was focused on the conversation at hand. The situation is already fixed, Whitmore. I own your airline. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. In his office, Whitmore's jaw clenched. The forced smile disappeared from his face as the reality of his position sank in. The PR team exchanged worried glances as they watched their boss's complexion turn an unhealthy shade of gray. They could hear the muffled sound of Elijah's voice through the phone, each word seeming to diminish Whitmore's presence in his own office. Whitmore gripped his armrest, his knuckles turning white. He'd dealt with hostile takeovers before, but never like this, never so fast, never so public, and never with such personal stakes. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of authority in his voice. Look, let's compromise, he said, leaning forward in his chair. We'll issue a public apology. We'll fire the flight attendant. You'll come out as the bigger man. He gestured enthusiastically to his PR team, as if they could somehow help him sell this solution through the phone. The silence that followed was deafening. Elijah let Whitmore's words hang in the air, each second of quiet making the older man more uncomfortable. In the first-class cabin, Elijah watched as Linda, the flight attendant who had him removed, nervously arranged drinks at the far end of the cabin, careful to avoid eye contact. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice carrying a weight that made Whitmore sink deeper into his chair. You don't get it, do you? What? Whitmore stammered. genuine confusion in his voice. He looked at his PR team helplessly, but they could only stare back with sympathetic expressions. Elijah's voice remained calm, but carried an unmistakable note of finality. "I don't want a PR stunt. I want real change. And from now on, every policy runs through me." Whitmore felt his stomach drop. The phone nearly slipped from his sweaty palm as the full impact of those words hit him. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. This wasn't something he could fix with a carefully worded press release or a strategic firing. This was about fundamental change, the very thing he'd spent years avoiding. In the cabin, Elijah ended the call without waiting for Whitmore's response. He slipped his phone into his pocket and turned his attention to Sarah, the young flight attendant who had been quietly observing everything since the incident began. Unlike Linda, Sarah had maintained her composure throughout the chaos, showing a quiet dignity that hadn't gone unnoticed. She stood near his seat, professional but not subservient, meeting his gaze with clear eyes that held both respect and a hint of hope. Elijah studied her for a moment before asking the question that had been forming in his mind since he first noticed her different approach. "What's the worst thing you've seen happen to a black passenger on this airline?" Sarah's expression flickered. She glanced around the cabin, where other passengers were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Linda had disappeared into the galley, but her presence still lingered in the tense atmosphere. Sarah's hands clasped together tightly, her internal struggle visible as she weighed years of institutional silence against the opportunity for honest change. Then, she swallowed hard and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of countless untold stories. "A lot worse than what happened to you." Elijah's jaw tightened at her words. His fingers gripped the armrest of his seat, and his eyes took on a steely determination. The late afternoon sun streaming through the window cast shadows across his face, highlighting the resolve in his expression. This wasn't just about his personal experience anymore. It wasn't about one incident or one flight attendant's prejudice. It was about a system that needed to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. In the privacy of his first-class seat, surrounded by passengers who had witnessed his humiliation and subsequent triumph, Elijah understood that buying the airline wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Sarah's whispered confession confirmed what he had suspected. His experience was merely the tip of an iceberg of discrimination that ran deep through the entire industry. The same passengers who had smirked at his removal now sat in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to a changing of the guard that promised to reshape more than just one airline's policies. Mr. Lancaster, the businessman who had mocked him earlier, kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, though he hadn't typed a word in the last hour. Linda's occasional appearances from the galley were marked by trembling hands and averted eyes, while Sarah continued her duties with quiet efficiency, her admission hanging in the air between her and Elijah like a shared secret that could no longer be contained. Linda stood in front of Elijah, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The first-class cabin felt smaller than usual, the air thick with tension as other passengers pretended to be absorbed in their magazines or tablets. But their occasional glances betrayed their intense interest in the unfolding scene. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, busied herself at the drink cart nearby, providing Linda moral support through her presence while maintaining a professional distance. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the cabin, highlighting the beads of sweat on Linda's forehead. Elijah sat in his leather seat, one hand resting casually on the armrest, the other holding his half-empty champagne glass. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held an intensity that made Linda struggle to meet his gaze. She kept fidgeting with her hands, smoothing her uniform skirt, adjusting her name tag. Anything to avoid direct eye contact with the man she had wrongfully removed from this very cabin less than an hour ago. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional clink of ice in someone's drink. Linda's face burned with humiliation, the memory of her earlier actions playing on repeat in her mind. The security guards, the dismissive tone in her voice, the assumptions she'd made. It all seemed so horrible now, so glaringly wrong, especially with the knowledge of who Elijah really was. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me, Linda, why did you do it?" The question hung in the air. Linda's throat felt dry as sandpaper. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I thought you didn't belong." The words came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet cabin, everyone heard them clearly, like a confession broadcast over the plane's intercom. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining neutral. "Because I'm young? Or because I'm black?" Linda's hands trembled visibly now. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, especially Mr. Lancaster, who had been so quick to support her earlier actions. Now he sat rigid in his seat, pretending to be deeply engrossed in his laptop screen, as if the spreadsheet before him contained the secrets of the universe. She hesitated, knowing her answer would reveal ugly truths about herself she'd never wanted to face. Then, almost inaudibly, "Both." The admission seemed to echo through the cabin. A passenger 2 rows back let out a small gasp. Sarah paused momentarily in her tasks, then continued with deliberate focus on arranging the drinks, the gentle clinking of glassware suddenly too loud. Linda felt panic rising in her chest like a trapped bird. Her palms were sweating, and she wiped them nervously on her uniform skirt. The need to defend herself, to explain away her actions, suddenly overwhelmed her. "I'm not racist," she blurted out, the words tumbling out faster than she could control them. I've never seen someone like you in first class, and I assumed." She trailed off, realizing how each word only dug her grave deeper, how hollow her defense sounded even to her own ears. Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed facade. "And that's the problem." His voice was quiet, but carried throughout the cabin like a verdict. Linda nodded, shame washing over her in waves. She could feel tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them back furiously. She didn't deserve to cry, not when she was the one who had caused harm, not when her tears would only center her own feelings rather than the injustice she had perpetrated. Around them, the other first-class passengers who had earlier snickered and smirked at Elijah's removal now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Lancaster shifted in his seat, his face flushed red as he remembered his own mocking comments. The laptop screen he pretended to study hadn't changed in the last 10 minutes, his finger hovering motionless over the trackpad. The tension in the cabin was palpable as everyone waited for Elijah's next words. Linda braced herself for the inevitable firing. She'd already imagined the walk of shame off the plane, the embarrassment of collecting her belongings from her locker, the difficulty of finding another job after this incident went viral. 20 years of service ended by 10 minutes of prejudice. Elijah leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. His fingers tapped thoughtfully on the armrest, a quiet drumbeat counting out the seconds of Linda's professional life. "You're not fired, Linda." Her eyes widened in shock, her head snapping up to meet his gaze for the first time. She must have misheard him, but no. His expression was serious, determined, with no hint of mockery or deception. "Instead," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of purpose, "you're going to face what you did. You'll be the first employee to go through my anti-bias training. You will listen to every person who has ever been humiliated like I was. You'll hear their stories until you truly understand." Linda nodded rapidly, relief and gratitude flooding through her body like a warm current. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Thank you. She struggled to find the right words to express her appreciation for this unexpected second chance, this mercy she hadn't earned. Several passengers exchanged surprised looks. Sarah, still at her drink cart. allowed a small smile to cross her face. Even Mr. Lancaster looked up from his laptop, genuine astonishment visible in his expression, his mouth slightly agape. Linda stood straighter, her hands finally still at her sides. She had never been so grateful to still have a job, but more than that, she felt the weight of the responsibility Elijah had just placed on her shoulders. This wasn't just about keeping her position. It was about facing her own prejudices and helping to create real change. For the first time in her career, she felt the true meaning of service. Days later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Kingsley Enterprises headquarters, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Elijah strode purposefully through the lobby, his footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet. Security guards nodded respectfully as he passed, their eyes following his determined path to the executive floor. The glass-walled conference room on the top floor offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, but none of the assembled team members were admiring the vista. Instead, all eyes were fixed on the multiple screens displaying news coverage of yesterday's events. Legal experts in crisp suits sat beside PR specialists clutching tablets, while Vanessa stood at the head of the table, remote in hand. Elijah's entrance brought an immediate hush to the quiet murmurs. He looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, showing no signs of fatigue despite the whirlwind of the past 24 hours. The only hint of his state of mind was the determined set of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. Vanessa clicked the remote, bringing up a live news feed on the main screen. A polished anchor's voice filled the room. Kingsley Airlines is already making headlines for its bold new leadership. But can Elijah Kingsley really change the industry? The question hung in the air as Elijah moved to the head of the table. He surveyed the room, taking in the mix of anticipation and uncertainty on his team's faces. Some had been with the company since his father's time, others were recent additions, but all knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. "Let's answer that question," Elijah said, clasping his hands together. His voice carried the quiet authority that had become his trademark. He turned to Vanessa. "Show them the numbers." Vanessa pulled up a series of graphs and statistics. Social media engagement is through the roof. The video of yesterday's incident has been viewed over 10 million times. We're trending on every major platform. The PR team exchanged glances. One of them, a veteran named Marcus, cleared his throat. "Sir, we could spin this as a positive PR move. Show how you turned a negative situation into an opportunity for growth." Elijah shook his head. "This isn't about PR. This is about fundamental change." The room fell silent as Elijah began outlining his vision. For the next several hours, the team worked tirelessly, drafting what would become the most comprehensive anti-discrimination policy in the airline industry. Laptops clicked, papers shuffled, and heated discussions broke out over specific wordings and implementations. The policy took shape point by point. The legal team meticulously reviewed each clause, ensuring it was both enforceable and comprehensive. The PR team worked on communication strategies to roll out the new policies. Through it all, Elijah remained focused, occasionally stepping in to clarify a point or push for stronger language. Around mid-morning, one of the older executives, Thompson, cleared his throat nervously. He was a holdover from the previous administration, known for his conservative approach. "Mr. Kingsley, while I appreciate the sentiment, this might alienate some of our more traditional customers." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Elijah turned to face Thompson. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held an intensity that made the executive shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Then they can fly somewhere else," Elijah stated, his voice carrying an edge of steel. The message was clear. There would be no compromise on this issue. Thompson sank back in his chair, properly chastised. Several other executives who might have harbored similar concerns remained silent, recognizing the futility of arguing against Elijah's resolve. The work continued through the morning. Vanessa coordinated with various departments, ensuring the new policies would be implemented across all levels of the airline. The training programs would begin immediately, with Linda's session scheduled for the following week. As Elijah reviewed the finalized policy document, his eyes scanning each paragraph with careful attention, Vanessa approached his chair. She held her tablet out, showing him a new email. "Linda just sent in her official apology," she said quietly. Elijah didn't look up from the document he was reviewing. His fingers continued to scroll through the pages as he responded. "Good. Let's see if she means it." The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the conference room floor. The city beyond the windows buzzed with activity, unaware that in this glass-walled room, an industry was about to change forever. The team continued their work, the sound of typing and quiet discussions filling the air. The news feeds on the screens continued to cycle through coverage of yesterday's events, but Elijah paid them no attention. He was focused on the future, on the changes he would implement, on the difference he would make. His father had built an empire, but Elijah would transform it into something more, a force for change in an industry that desperately needed it. The policy document in front of him wasn't just a response to one incident. It was the beginning of a new era for Kingsley Airlines. The media storm hit like a tsunami. Within hours of Elijah's new anti-discrimination policy announcement, social media platforms exploded with stories that had been buried for years. The hashtag #Kingsley Airline Stories trended nationwide, each post revealing darker and darker chapters of the airline's history. In her downtown Manhattan apartment, Sarah Chen, a prominent investment banker, sat in front of her webcam, sharing her story with a major news network. Her hands trembled slightly as she recounted her experience from just 6 months ago. "I had my first-class ticket in hand," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "My credit card was platinum level, and I'd flown first class dozens of times. But the gate agent insisted on calling her supervisor because she was concerned about fraud." Sarah paused, composing herself. "They made me step aside while other passengers boarded. They called the credit card company. Twice. All while people stared at me like I was a criminal." The interviewer leaned forward. "And what happened then?" "By the time they finally believed me, I'd missed my flight. I had to cancel an important meeting that cost my firm millions." Sarah's eyes hardened. "When I complained, they offered me airline miles as compensation." The story spread like wildfire across social media platforms. But it was just the beginning. James Richardson, a retired pilot with 30 years of experience, sat in CNN's studio, his decorated military service photos displayed behind him. His story made headlines across the country. "I flew combat missions in Desert Storm," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of frustration. "I had more flight hours than anyone in my division, but every time a senior position opened up, they found a reason why I wasn't quite ready." He shook his head, bitter memories evident in his expression. "Watched younger white pilots with half my experience get promoted over me. 15 years of excellence, and all I got was excuses." The interviewer asked, "Did you ever file a complaint?" James laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Filed 3. Each time, they buried it in bureaucracy until I gave up. That's how the system works, or used to work, until now." Perhaps the most heartbreaking story came from Monica Williams, a mother from Atlanta. Her interview on Good Morning America brought viewers to tears as she described what happened to her 12-year-old son, Marcus. "He was flying alone for the first time, going to visit his grandmother," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "We paid extra for the unaccompanied minor service. But halfway through the flight, a white passenger complained that she felt uncomfortable with Marcus sitting next to her." The host's face showed shock. "What was the reason?" Monica's voice cracked. "There was no reason. My son was reading a book and listening to music. But instead of defending him, the flight attendant moved him to the back of the plane. He called me crying when he landed." She looked directly into the camera. He was 12 years old. What message does that send to a child? The stories kept coming. Former flight attendants revealed systematic discrimination in hiring practices. Ground crew members shared accounts of being passed over for promotions. Passengers detailed countless incidents of profiling, harassment, and humiliation. In his office at Kingsley Enterprises, Elijah watched these interviews on multiple screens. Each story added another layer of tension to his already rigid posture. His fingers drummed against his desk, a rare display of agitation from someone known for his composure. Vanessa entered silently, carrying a thick manila folder. She watched as Elijah's jaw clenched at a particularly disturbing account from a former employee who had been fired for reporting discrimination. "I have something you need to see," she said, placing the folder in front of him. "These are the lawsuits your airline settled quietly in the past." Elijah opened the folder and his eyes widened slightly. Page after page of confidential settlements, each one carefully worded to protect the airline's reputation. The numbers were staggering, not just in terms of money paid out, but in the sheer volume of cases. He flipped through them methodically, his expression growing darker with each page. There were patterns, similar incidents, similar responses, similar cover-ups. The settlements came with strict non-disclosure agreements, effectively silencing the victims. One case detailed how a black executive was removed from a flight because another passenger claimed he was acting suspicious. He had been reviewing confidential business documents. Another described how a black woman and her young daughters were forced to wait 3 hours for a flight while the airline verified their first-class tickets. The dates on the files stretched back years. Some of the cases had been settled for substantial sums, others for insultingly small amounts. But they all shared one thing. They had been buried, hidden from public view, treated as problems to be solved with money rather than changes to the system. Elijah's stomach turned as he read account after account. The clinical language of the legal documents couldn't hide the human cost of each incident. Behind every settlement was a person who had been humiliated, discriminated against, or worse. With a sudden movement, Elijah slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed through his office like a gunshot. "Change isn't coming," he muttered, his voice low but intense. His hands remained pressed flat against the closed folder, as if containing the ugly truth within. Vanessa smiled, a fierce expression that matched his determination. "Good, because the board won't like what you're doing." Elijah leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then they can fight me." The mahogany-lined boardroom of Kingsley Airlines exuded old money and tradition. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the long table, where 15 of the most powerful executives in the aviation industry sat waiting. Their Rolex watches and designer suits couldn't hide their nervous energy as they shifted in their leather chairs, occasionally glancing at the empty chair at the head of the table with barely concealed apprehension. The portraits of former airline presidents watched from the walls, silent witnesses to what everyone knew would be a pivotal meeting. Mr. Whitmore occupied his usual seat near the head of the table, but his typical confident posture was notably absent. Instead, he kept adjusting his tie and checking his phone, his forehead shining with a thin layer of sweat. Around him, board members, most of them white men in their 60s, exchanged meaningful glances and whispered in hushed tones that died away whenever someone looked in their direction. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch, a collective holding of breath before the storm. The heavy double doors swung open, and Elijah Kingsley strode in. Despite being the youngest person in the room by at least 2 decades, he commanded attention instantly. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but his presence, not his clothes, demanded respect. The room fell silent, as if someone had flipped a switch, the tension thickening the air. His confident steps echoed against the hardwood floor as he approached the head of the table, his expression unreadable but determined. Theodore Walsh, one of the oldest board members, cleared his throat. "Mr. Kingsley, we've been waiting to discuss..." "The new anti-discrimination policies," Elijah finished for him, his voice calm but firm. He didn't sit down. Instead, he remained standing at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood, his shoulders squared with quiet confidence. The gold cufflinks at his wrists caught the light as he leaned forward slightly. "Let's be clear," he began, his eyes scanning the faces around the table, meeting each gaze directly. "This airline has a racism problem. We're about to fix it." His words hung in the air, simple but powerful, leaving no room for debate. Richard Pembroke, a board member known for his conservative views, scoffed audibly. His jowls quivered as he spoke. "We don't need a PR nightmare, Elijah." He emphasized Elijah's first name, trying to establish dominance through familiarity, a tactic that had worked with countless young executives before. His smug expression suggested he thought he had the upper hand. Elijah's response was a dark chuckle that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "No, what you don't need is another lawsuit." He pulled out a thick folder and let it drop onto the table with a heavy thud. "And I have all your settlement records." His fingers lingered on the folder for a moment, a silent reminder of the power it represented. The sound of the folder hitting the table seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Several board members paled visibly, their expressions shifting from dismissive to concerned in an instant. Others looked away, unable to meet Elijah's steady gaze, suddenly finding great interest in their notepads or water glasses. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Whitmore, attempting to salvage some control over the situation, cleared his throat. "Elijah, we respect what you're trying to do, but nothing," Elijah cut him off sharply. His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before, like steel wrapped in velvet. "The policies stay. You don't like it? Resign." He stood taller now, his presence filling the room despite his youth. The word resign hung in the air like a challenge. Some board members exchanged shocked looks. They weren't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone they considered an outsider, someone they had privately dismissed as a young upstart playing at business. The unspoken hierarchy they'd relied on for decades was crumbling before their eyes. Harold Matthews, a board member with 30 years in the industry, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You can't just come in here and—" "I can," Elijah interrupted again. "And I am." His calm demeanor made his authority even more apparent, like a lion that doesn't need to roar to prove its strength. "I own 51% of this airline. That means what I say goes." His words were measured, each one landing with precision and finality. Matthew's face turned red, the color spreading up his neck and into his cheeks like a thermometer rising. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Two other board members, both older men who had been with the airline for decades, followed suit, gathering their things in angry movements, muttering under their breath about young blood and respect. As they stormed out, the remaining board members watched in stunned silence. The sound of the door slamming behind them reverberated through the room, punctuating the shift in power that had just occurred. The empty chairs they left behind seemed to underscore the changing of the guard. Whitmore, looking deflated, sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "You're really going to shake the industry up, aren't you?" His voice carried a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration. Elijah's lips curved into a knowing smirk. "You have no idea." His eyes gleamed with purpose and determination, the promise of change radiating from him like heat. The remaining board members sat in uncomfortable silence, the reality of their new situation sinking in. The old guard was changing, whether they liked it or not, and Elijah Kingsley was the catalyst that would transform everything they had grown comfortable with. The boardroom that had witnessed decades of the status quo would now become ground zero for revolution. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead in the small training room at Kingsley Airline's newly established Diversity and Inclusion Training Center. Linda Carter sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She wore her flight attendant uniform, pressed and perfect as always, but today it felt more like armor than professional attire. Around her, other airline employees filled the rows of chairs. Pilots in their crisp white shirts and epaulettes sat near the front, while flight attendants and gate agents occupied the middle rows. The air was thick with nervous energy. Everyone knew why they were here, and no one felt particularly comfortable about it. Linda noticed how some of her colleagues avoided making eye contact with her. The viral video of her confrontation with Elijah Kingsley had made her infamous within the company. She could feel their sideways glances, hear their whispered conversations. Some probably wondered why she hadn't been fired. Others might have been grateful it wasn't them in her position. The quiet murmur of conversation died down as a woman approached the podium at the front of the room. Dr. Angela Matthews carried herself with quiet confidence, her natural hair styled professionally, her business suit tailored perfectly. She didn't need to demand attention. Her presence commanded it naturally. "Welcome, Doctor." Matthews began, her voice clear and authoritative. "Today we confront the biases we don't even realize we have." Her eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on Linda, who felt her throat tighten in response. Linda swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. She had expected someone angry, someone who would point fingers and shame them. Instead, Dr. Matthews spoke with a calm certainty that somehow made everything feel more serious. The lights dimmed as Dr. Matthews began the presentation. The first video appeared on the screen. A black executive describing how a flight attendant had repeatedly questioned his first-class ticket, even after he'd shown it 3 times. The man's voice trembled slightly as he recounted how other passengers had stared, how some had snickered. Linda's stomach churned. The situation felt painfully familiar. More stories followed. A black woman described being accused of using a stolen credit card to purchase her ticket. A family told their story of being separated on a flight because white passengers had complained about sitting next to them. Each account was delivered with dignity, but the pain in their voices was unmistakable. Former black employees shared their experiences next. A pilot with 20 years of experience described being passed over for promotions in favor of less qualified white colleagues. A flight attendant recalled being written up for attitude problems when she spoke up against discrimination. The statistics appeared on screen in stark white text against a dark background. Black passengers were twice as likely to be removed from flights due to complaints from other passengers. They were 3 times more likely to be questioned about their ticket class, 4 times more likely to be reported as suspicious by crew members. Linda shifted in her seat, her discomfort growing with each new revelation. She thought about all the times she'd made quick judgments, all the assumptions she'd never questioned. The weight of her actions pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Dr. Matthews noticed her movement. "Linda," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "What do you think?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Linda, who felt her face grow hot under their collective gaze. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and forced herself to speak louder. "I did what I did because I thought I was protecting the airline." The words felt hollow as soon as they left her mouth. She paused, then continued, her voice growing smaller but more honest. "But I never stopped to think who I was actually hurting." Dr. Matthews nodded, letting the admission hang in the air. The silence that followed felt heavy with understanding, as if Linda's words had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. When the session ended, most employees filed out quickly, their faces showing various degrees of shock, shame, and contemplation. But Linda remained seated, watching as her colleagues departed. She felt rooted to her chair, as if moving might break whatever clarity she had gained during the session. Finally, when the room was almost empty, she stood up on shaky legs and approached Dr. Matthews, who was gathering her materials at the podium. "How do I fix this?" Linda asked, her voice trembling with emotion. She wasn't just talking about the incident with Elijah anymore. She meant everything: her assumptions, her biases, her whole way of thinking. Dr. Matthews turned to face her, studying Linda's expression carefully. There was no immediate warmth in her gaze, but there was something else, a willingness to see the possibility of change. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick notebook, its cover unmarked except for the words, "Personal Journey," in simple black text. "Listen," Dr. Matthews said, holding out the notebook. "Learn." She waited until Linda took it with both hands. "And do better." Linda nodded, clutching the notebook to her chest like a lifeline. She wasn't sure if she'd ever earn forgiveness, from Elijah, from her colleagues, from herself, but she was willing to try. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Elijah's corner office at Kingsley Airlines headquarters. He sat at his sleek desk, reviewing the latest training implementation reports when Vanessa burst through the door, her usually composed demeanor replaced with barely contained excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she announced, striding across the polished hardwood floor, her heels clicking with each step. She held her phone out, screen facing Elijah. Elijah looked up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow at her unusual entrance. "What is it?" "Carter Sinclair just publicly backed you." Vanessa's voice carried a note of triumph as she turned the screen toward him. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of enthusiasm she rarely showed in their professional setting. Elijah's eyes widened slightly. Carter Sinclair wasn't just any celebrity. He was a hip-hop mogul and billionaire, known for his business acumen as much as his music. His influence in both the entertainment industry and Black community was undeniable. The endorsement was unexpected, but perfectly timed. The tweet displayed on Vanessa's phone read, "Finally, an airline that respects Black travelers. I'll be booking my next tour exclusively with Kingsley Airlines." The engagement numbers were staggering, 5 million likes and climbing rapidly, with shares multiplying by the second. "This is huge," Vanessa said, scrolling through the responses. "His reach is massive, and he rarely endorses anything publicly. This could change everything for us." Within hours, the impact of Sinclair's endorsement became clear. The airline's stock, which had taken a hit during the initial controversy, rebounded dramatically. Trading volumes surged as investors rushed to get in on what was quickly becoming a cultural movement. Financial analysts who had questioned Elijah's decisions were suddenly scrambling to revise their projections. Vanessa's phone kept buzzing with notifications. "It's like a domino effect," she said, reading through the updates. "NBA stars are tweeting about booking with us. Hollywood A-listers are canceling their private jets to fly Kingsley. Even tech CEOs are getting in on it. Everyone wants to be part of this moment." Social media was ablaze with support. Influential civil rights activists praised Elijah's leadership, calling it a watershed moment for corporate accountability. Popular influencers shared their own stories of discrimination in air travel, using the hashtag #FlyWithRespect, which quickly began trending nationwide. Personal testimonials flooded in from passengers who felt seen and valued for the first time. The airline's booking system nearly crashed from the sudden surge in reservations. Their competitor airlines watched helplessly as their market share began to slip away. The movement was spreading beyond just leisure travel. Corporate accounts were switching their preferred carrier status to Kingsley Airlines, bringing with them millions in guaranteed annual bookings. Elijah's phone rang. It was Whitmore. "This is getting huge," Whitmore said without preamble, his voice urgent. "We need to capitalize on it." Elijah leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk playing across his face. "We? You didn't even want these policies in place." He ran his finger along the edge of his desk, savoring the moment. There was a pause on the line, followed by a heavy exhale. "All right, you win," Whitmore conceded. "Let's roll out the changes across all routes immediately." Elijah could hear the resignation in Whitmore's voice, the sound of old power finally yielding to new reality. It was a sweet victory, but Elijah knew better than to gloat. He remained professional, discussing implementation timelines and resource allocation, making mental notes of how quickly Whitmore had changed his tune when success became undeniable. After hanging up, Elijah turned his attention to the wall-mounted television in his office, where news channels were running constant coverage of the Kingsley Airlines transformation. His face appeared on screen after screen, accompanied by headlines like "Aviation's New Era" and "How One Man's Stand Changed an Industry." Commentators who had dismissed him weeks earlier now praised his vision and courage. Vanessa sat at the conference table in his office, monitoring social media responses and coordinating with their PR team. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, directing their response to the wave of attention. Suddenly, her typing stopped. Her brow furrowed as she stared at her laptop screen. "Elijah," she said, her voice carrying a note of concern that made him turn away from the TV. "You need to see this." She turned her laptop around, and Elijah's smirk faded as he read the statement from a rival airline. The competing carrier, one of the largest in the country, had just released a provocative response to Kingsley's reforms. The statement called his anti-discrimination policies unnecessary virtue signaling and announced their own traditional values airline model. They promised no woke politics on our planes, clearly positioning themselves as the conservative alternative to Kingsley's progressive stance. Elijah felt his chest tighten as he read the words. The statement was a calculated move to appeal to those who opposed his changes, trying to turn what should have been a simple matter of human dignity into a cultural war battleground. His jaw clenched as he considered the implications. The rival airline stock had begun to rise as conservative commentators praised their stance. Social media was already dividing into camps, with some calling for boycotts of Kingsley Airlines, while others doubled down on their support. What had started as a corporate policy change was rapidly becoming a defining cultural moment. Vanessa watched Elijah's reaction carefully. She knew that look in his eyes, the same one he'd had when he decided to buy the airline in the first place. The determined set of his shoulders and the slight narrowing of his gaze signaled that his resolve was only strengthening. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was clear that it was just beginning to escalate into something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. The sleek private jet cut through the clouds, its engines humming quietly as Elijah sat in his custom leather seat, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial reports. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the cabin, but Elijah's expression remained serious as he studied the numbers before him. His fingers tapped methodically against the armrest, a habit he'd developed years ago when deep in thought. Kingsley Airlines was thriving in many ways. Passenger bookings had increased by 40%. Their social media following had exploded. Celebrity endorsements poured in daily. But beneath the surface success, trouble was brewing. The financial projections showed concerning patterns that couldn't be ignored, no matter how impressive the public-facing metrics appeared. Vanessa handed him another report, her face tight with concern. 3 more corporate investors pulled out this morning, she said, sliding into the seat opposite him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered both good and bad news countless times. Elijah's jaw clenched as he scanned the document. Major companies that had been longtime partners with the airline were quietly withdrawing their support. The numbers were significant, enough to impact their long-term expansion plans. He ran his hand over his face, taking a moment to process the implications. "What's their official reason?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The pattern had become painfully familiar over the past few months. "The usual corporate speak," Vanessa replied, sitting across from him. "Strategic realignment of investment priorities. But we both know what's really happening." She crossed her arms, her expression a mixture of frustration and determination. Elijah nodded. The rival airlines were working behind the scenes, whispering in boardrooms and country club lounges. They were painting Kingsley Airlines as a risky investment, suggesting that Elijah's reforms would lead to financial ruin. It was a calculated campaign to starve them of capital. Old money protecting old ways, afraid of the changes he represented. His phone buzzed with a message from one of his remaining board members. "We need to talk about scaling back some of these changes. The pace is too aggressive." The words glowed accusingly on his screen. Elijah deleted the message without responding. He'd been getting similar suggestions from several executives lately, all pushing for a more moderate approach. They wanted to water down the reforms, to make them more palatable to conservative investors, to compromise on principles for profit, exactly what his father had warned him against. The jet began its descent toward the private airfield where the investor summit would be held. Through the window, Elijah could see the sprawling resort complex where some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the aviation industry gathered annually to make deals and shape the future of air travel. Perfectly manicured lawns surrounded elegant buildings, a playground for the privileged. "Are you ready for this?" Vanessa asked, gathering their presentation materials, her movements crisp and efficient. Elijah straightened his tie, his expression resolute. "They're not ready for me." His voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute certainty. The summit's main conference room was exactly what Elijah expected: old money and older attitudes. Wealthy men in expensive suits sat around a massive mahogany table, their combined net worth probably exceeding the GDP of several small nations. The air was thick with expensive cologne and thinly veiled condescension. Paintings of former aviation pioneers, all white men, lined the wood-paneled walls. Elijah stood at the head of the table, his presentation displayed on the large screen behind him. He'd just finished showing the airline's impressive growth numbers when Theodore Walsh, a longtime investor known for his traditional views, scoffed loudly. His silver hair and tailored suit couldn't hide the disdain in his eyes. "Impressive short-term gains, Elijah," Walsh said, his voice dripping with patronizing concern. "But you're alienating traditional customers." He emphasized traditional in a way that made the coded language perfectly clear to everyone present. The room shifted uncomfortably. Several other investors nodded in agreement, exchanging knowing glances across the polished table. Elijah met Walsh's gaze steadily. "I'm creating an airline where everyone is treated fairly. The numbers show that's good for business." He kept his voice even, refusing to rise to the bait. James Morton, a gray-haired CEO of a major investment firm, smirked from his seat. "And how long do you think that will last when the money dries up?" He gestured to the other investors. "You're losing support, Elijah. Without backing, your little social experiment will fail." His gold cufflinks caught the light as he leaned back, satisfied with his pronouncement. The room grew quiet, waiting for Elijah's response. They expected him to backtrack, to compromise, to show weakness. Instead, he smiled. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but communicated absolute confidence. "Actually," Elijah said, clicking to the next slide, "I'd like to announce a new partnership." His finger pressed the remote with deliberate precision. The screen filled with the logo of Sinclair Entertainment and Travel, Carter Sinclair's billion-dollar empire. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Coffee cups froze midway to lips, and several pens clattered onto the table. "Carter Sinclair has agreed to not only invest in Kingsley Airlines, but to make us the exclusive carrier for his entire entertainment and sports network," Elijah continued, his voice carrying easily over the stunned whispers. "This includes his record label's artists, his sports agency's athletes, and his film studio's talent." Each word landed with the impact of a chess piece capturing a key position. The old investors sat up straighter, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and dismay. They all knew Sinclair's reputation. He was known for massive, game-changing deals that transformed industries. More importantly, his influence extended far beyond their insular circles. "Furthermore," Elijah continued, enjoying the growing discomfort in the room, We're launching a premium VIP travel service specifically designed for high-profile black celebrities, athletes, and executives. A market segment that has been historically underserved and overlooked. He paused, letting the implications sink in. He clicked through slides showing mock-ups of luxury lounges, exclusive terminals, and specialized concierge services. Mr. Sinclair's investment more than makes up for any recent funding withdrawals. In fact, it exceeds them tenfold. The numbers displayed on the screen told their own story, one of growth and opportunity that they were now on the outside of. Walsh's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Morton stared at his hands, avoiding eye contact. The other investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they had just lost any leverage they thought they had over Kingsley Airlines. The power dynamic had shifted before their eyes. The future of aviation isn't about maintaining old prejudices, Elijah said, his voice firm. It's about creating an inclusive, profitable airline that serves all passengers with dignity and respect. Those who don't understand that will be left behind. He closed his presentation folder with a quiet finality. As the meeting concluded, investors filed out of the room, many of them already on their phones, likely calling their advisors to reevaluate their positions. Elijah gathered his materials, satisfied with how things had played out. The quiet buzz of conversation carried notes of both concern and recalculation. Walsh lingered behind, approaching Elijah with a scowl. "You're making enemies, Kingsley," he muttered, his voice low and threatening. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and entitlement. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "Good," he replied simply, before turning and walking away, leaving Walsh standing alone in the conference room, surrounded by the echoes of a changing industry. The afternoon sun streamed through the airplane windows as Flight KA-317 cruised at 35,000 feet, somewhere over the Midwest. The gentle hum of engines filled the cabin, and most passengers had settled into their routines, reading books, watching movies, or dozing off under thin airline blankets. Elijah sat in first class, reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet. The past few months had been a whirlwind of changes at Kingsley Airlines, and he wanted to ensure every detail was perfect. Sarah, the flight attendant who had shown such integrity during his own incident, now served as the head of in-flight services. She passed by occasionally, making sure everything met the airline's new high standards. The peaceful flight atmosphere shattered when angry voices erupted from economy class. "I'm telling you, he's acting suspicious!" A man's voice carried clearly through the cabin. "He keeps looking around and checking his phone." Elijah's head snapped up. The tablet forgotten, he listened intently as the commotion grew louder. "Sir, please lower your voice," a flight attendant said, trying to maintain calm. "No, I want him removed from this flight. He's making me uncomfortable." Elijah stood up, his movements deliberate. As he made his way toward economy class, he could see the scene unfolding clearly. A white man in his 50s, wearing an expensive business suit, stood in the aisle, pointing accusingly at a black teenager who sat pressed against his window seat. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a basketball jersey and looking absolutely terrified. The flight attendant, Jenny Miller, stood between them, clearly struggling with the situation. She'd completed the new training program, but facing a real-time confrontation was different from classroom scenarios. "He's probably up to something," the man continued, his face red with anger. "Back in the good old days, we didn't have to put up with this sort of thing." The teenager clutched his phone tightly, his hands trembling. Other passengers watched uncomfortably, some filming with their phones, others pretending not to notice. The scene was painfully familiar to Elijah. He saw himself in that scared young face. "Is there a problem here?" Elijah's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The cabin fell silent. Passengers who recognized him straightened in their seats. The angry man turned, ready to continue his tirade, but the words died in his throat as he realized who stood before him. "Mr. Kingsley, Jenny's relief was evident. What's the procedure for this situation, Jenny? Elijah asked calmly, his eyes never leaving the angry passenger. Jenny stood straighter, finding her voice. According to our new policies, we don't remove passengers based on unfounded complaints or perceived suspicions. All passengers have the right to fly without harassment. That's correct, Elijah nodded. So handle this properly. The businessman's face twisted with indignation. Do you know who I am? I'm a platinum member. This is ridiculous. What happened to the old rules? Elijah turned to face him fully, his expression cold and commanding. They changed because of people like you. He gestured to Jenny. Please escort this gentleman off the plane. He's in violation of our anti-harassment policies. You can't do this, the man spluttered. Actually, I can, and I am. Elijah's voice carried authority that brooked no argument. You have two choices. Leave the plane voluntarily, or be removed and permanently banned from Kingsley Airlines. Your choice. Two air marshals appeared, another new policy Elijah had implemented. They stood ready, waiting for any sign of resistance. The businessman looked around, seeking support from other passengers, but found none. Even those who might have agreed with him stayed silent, unwilling to challenge Elijah Kingsley on his own airline. This is outrageous, the man muttered, but gathered his belongings. The air marshals escorted him toward the exit, where a gate agent waited to process his removal. As the commotion died down, Elijah turned to the teenage boy, who looked up at him with a mixture of awe and lingering fear. What's your name? Elijah asked gently. Marcus, the boy replied softly. Marcus Johnson. You okay, Marcus? The teenager nodded, then found his voice. Thank you. Elijah smiled warmly and placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. No one's kicking you off this flight, kid. You belong here. The simple words carried weight beyond their meaning. Around them, several passengers nodded in approval. Some even applauded quietly. Jenny, the flight attendant, smiled, standing taller with renewed confidence in her role. As Elijah turned to head back to his seat, Marcus called out, Mr. Kingsley? Elijah paused, looking back. I read about what happened to you. That's why I chose to fly Kingsley Airlines. Marcus's voice grew stronger. My mom said you're changing things. The words hit Elijah hard. This wasn't just about business anymore. This wasn't about stock prices or market share or corporate politics. This was about Marcus and countless others like him who deserved to travel without fear. This was a revolution in the making, one flight at a time. The morning sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Elijah Kingsley sat at the head of the crisis conference table at Kingsley Airlines headquarters. The massive screen before him flashed headline after headline, each more damaging than the last. The sleek conference room, usually a place of progress and innovation, now felt heavy with tension. Kingsley Airlines under fire. Is this the end of the experiment? Scrolled across the screen in bold letters. Before anyone could process that, another headline replaced it. Industry giants call Elijah Kingsley's reforms too extreme. The final blow came with major investors dump Kingsley stock, turbulence ahead. Across the polished mahogany table, Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The remaining board members, less than half of the original number, exchanged worried glances. The morning coffee sat untouched in their cups, growing cold. It's a coordinated attack, Vanessa announced, standing to Elijah's right. She clicked through a series of slides on her tablet, which appeared on the screen. Orion Air isn't just competing, they're trying to destroy us. The evidence was damning. Orion Air, their largest competitor, had launched a sophisticated campaign of destruction. They'd funded research firms to produce fake reports about Kingsley Airlines' performance. Their PR team had planted negative stories in major news outlets. Most disturbing of all, they'd secretly approached Kingsley's largest investors, offering them lucrative deals to pull their funding. "This just broke an hour ago," Vanessa said, pulling up a new report. The room collectively inhaled as they read the headline. Leaked. Kingsley Airlines accused of anti-white discrimination. The report, clearly fabricated but convincingly presented, claimed that Kingsley Airlines was deliberately prioritizing black passengers over others. It cited anonymous sources and twisted statistics to paint a picture of reverse discrimination. "Social media is exploding," one board member noted, scrolling through his phone. "Calls for boycotts are trending." Vanessa nodded grimly. "We've traced hundreds of these accounts. They're bots and trolls, funded through shell companies that all lead back to one source: Orion Air." Elijah sat silently through all of this, his expression unreadable. But those who knew him well could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his clasped hands. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal, a targeted attack from an industry that had never wanted him to succeed, that had fought against change at every turn. "They're trying to bury us," Whitmore said, his voice heavy. "The old guard never wanted these changes. They're using every trick in the book to maintain the status quo." Elijah finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "They're not just fighting our policies, they're fighting progress itself." Vanessa moved purposefully to Elijah's side, sliding a thick manila folder across the table toward him. "It's time to fight back," she said quietly. The folder made a soft thud as it landed in front of him. Elijah opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. Gradually, a small smirk appeared on his face. That evening, the Kingsley Airlines press room was packed with journalists. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning as Elijah took the podium, looking impeccable in a tailored navy suit. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today I'm here to address the recent attacks on Kingsley Airlines. But more importantly, I'm here to expose the truth about who's behind them." With a nod to Vanessa, the screen behind him came to life. What followed was a systematic dismantling of Orion Air's facade. Emails appeared showing CEO Mark Reynolds discussing ways to maintain traditional passenger demographics. Internal memos detailed strategies for quietly settling discrimination cases out of court. Financial records revealed millions spent on covering up incidents of racial profiling. The room grew deathly quiet as 15 years' worth of discrimination cases unfolded before them. Videos played, showing Orion Air executives in private meetings, laughing about how Kingsley Airlines would never survive in what they called a white-dominated industry. Gasps filled the room as Elijah revealed document after document, each more damning than the last. The evidence was irrefutable. Orion Air hadn't just discriminated against passengers. They'd actively worked to maintain a system of inequality in the airline industry. "This isn't about competition," Elijah stated, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "This is about protecting a broken system that benefits the few at the expense of the many." A reporter in the front row raised her hand, her voice shaking slightly. "Mr. Kingsley, what do you plan to do now?" Elijah leaned into the microphone, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I'm going to buy Orion Air." The room erupted in chaos, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing frantically. But Elijah remained calm at the podium, the evidence of his victory displayed clearly behind him, while across town, in the Orion Air headquarters, Mark Reynolds watched his empire begin to crumble. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Elijah Kingsley's new office, painting the sleek furniture in hues of gold and amber. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the city skyline that stretched endlessly before him. The view from the top floor of Kingsley Airlines headquarters offered a panoramic vista of his growing empire, a testament to how far he'd come in just 6 months. The headlines from that morning's business papers still echoed in his mind. Kingsley Airlines, the new giant of aviation. The industry landscape had shifted dramatically since his takeover of Orion Air. The scandal he'd exposed had sent shockwaves through the aviation world, bringing Orion's stock prices crashing down. Their reputation, built over decades, had crumbled in days. When Elijah had stepped in to buy their remaining assets, it wasn't just a business acquisition, it was a statement. The old guard's resistance to change had backfired spectacularly. Now, those same board members who'd once sneered at his reforms were watching from the sidelines as Kingsley Airlines soared to new heights. The sound of heels clicking against marble flooring drew his attention. Vanessa entered the office, her characteristic efficiency evident in her brisk walk. She carried a thick file folder in her hands, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Final signatures," she announced, placing the folder on his desk. "You officially own it all." Elijah turned from the window, his eyes falling on the documents that represented the culmination of months of strategic planning and unwavering determination. The merger was complete. Kingsley Airlines had absorbed every last piece of Orion Air's infrastructure, from their routes to their fleet. The stock prices had rebounded beyond anyone's expectations. Investors who jumped ship during the crisis now called daily, practically begging to reinvest. Their sudden change of heart amused Elijah. It was amazing how quickly too extreme became visionary when success was undeniable. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Linda Carter stood in the doorway, her posture notably different from their first encounter months ago. Gone was the arrogant flight attendant who'd had him removed from first class. In her place stood someone humbled by experience, changed by understanding. She'd been through every training program Kingsley Airlines offered, not just attending, but actively participating. Reports showed she'd become one of the most vocal advocates for change within the company, sharing her story as a cautionary tale during orientation sessions. "Mr. Kingsley," she said softly, stepping into the office. Her hands fidgeted slightly with the hem of her uniform jacket. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say thank you for not ruining me when you could have." Elijah studied her for a long moment, noting the sincerity in her eyes, the way she held herself, no longer defensive, but open and genuine. The change in her was evident, a living example of what education and accountability could achieve. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "Just promise me one thing." Linda swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything. Make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Her response was immediate and firm, her voice stronger now. "I will." Later that evening, Elijah boarded his private jet, the first fully Kingsley-owned aircraft in the new fleet. The cabin crew greeted him with genuine warmth and respect, their smiles reaching their eyes. The interior gleamed with newness, but it was the atmosphere that truly felt different. There was an energy of possibility, of progress. A young black pilot approached him, his uniform crisp and new, his shoulders straight with pride. "Sir," he said, extending his hand, "I just wanted to say, I never thought I'd get this job, but because of you, I did." Elijah grasped his hand firmly, meeting his eyes with a warm smile. "You belong here." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Elijah settled into his seat, Vanessa taking her place beside him. Through the window, he could see the sun setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The engines hummed to life, a familiar sound that now carried new meaning. Vanessa nudged him gently. "You did it, Elijah." He continued gazing out the window, watching as the clouds rolled past in gentle waves. A knowing smirk crossed his face as he replied, "This was just the beginning." The plane lifted smoothly into the darkening sky, carrying with it the promise of a new era in aviation, one where dignity and respect weren't determined by the color of someone's skin or the assumptions of others, but by the simple fact of their humanity. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.